So welcome on this bitterly cold, typical Cleveland Thursday afternoon for the winter of 1913-14. But hopefully we'll have, not heated discussion, but we will be warmed by the light of intellectual discussion and consideration of matters today. I'm Joe White. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department and director of the Center for Policy Studies at Case Western Reserve University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Global Currents discussion, which is supported by the generosity of Ms. Eloise Briskin. And in the Global Currents discussions, we bring in scholars from around the country and sometimes from around the world to talk about some aspect of international politics, international relations, international public affairs. And today we decided to go for a really big topic, globalization, and can globalization be governed? And there's a little history to how we came to invite today's speaker, Professor Tony Porter, which is that I first became aware of Professor Porter as I was reading one of my colleagues' work and trying to think of people who might either participate in a 10-year review or advise me about who else should have participated in a 10-year review, who also works in this field. And then a few years later, I was reviewing the work of another of my colleagues, trying to figure out who also works in this field, and guess who came up again as somebody who works in this field? I said, wow. So then if this year, when we were trying to discuss who to invite, a third colleague said, gee, it'd be really great if we could invite Tony Porter. And I'm sitting there, where did I hear that name before? And the answer is that Professor Porter's work is on international financial regulation, international organizations, globalization and its governance in many different ways, is really central to the interests of a number of our own faculty. Therefore, when I said, yeah, that's a really good idea, it's really nice to come up with an idea that a number of your fellow faculty members say, yeah, that's a great idea. So really, on behalf of the whole department, it is my pleasure to welcome you here today, Tony. Now, Tony is, Professor Porter is Director, Associate Dean for Graduate Studies at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. He's spent his entire teaching career, I believe, right. More than 20 years at McMaster after getting his PhD at Carleton University, which has, I think, for a very long time been one of the leading institutions for the study of international political economy. It gets sort of hard to keep track of his books because there's one that just came out, which is Transnational Financial Regulation After the Crisis, in which I should point out that our own Professor Catherine C. Lavelle has a chapter on what things in the United States, the banks and the Dodd-Frank Act. That's an edited volume. Last year he published Transnational Financial Associations and the Governance of Global Finance. And I think it's fair to say that if there was a short list of scholars who really work on the governance of transnational governance of the global economic system and how that works, if it works at all, Professor Tony Porter is very much on that short list. So it is my great pleasure to welcome him here today and now to sit down and listen to what he has to say.
Well, thank you so much, Joe, for that really generous introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm from Hamilton, and it's not that far, so it was wonderful to be able to come and see people who I've been working with, like Professor Lavelle, Professor Posner, and others, and to be able to be here, so thanks. What I'm going to do is start with a couple of comments on globalization in general, and then talk about global governance. So this is DHL, the courier company, is very interested in how connected the world is because they deliver packages all over the place. And so they have an interesting set of data with about 1 million data points across all the countries to measure what's happening with globalization. And here the depth is the one that dropped and then started going up again. That's the percentage, say, of each country, say, of trade or finance that's global. And the breadth is the extent that it goes across the world. So you can see after the crisis, there was a kind of reversal of globalization. And so we often assume that globalization is just going to keep expanding and expanding, but that's really not the case. So similarly, this is from the International Monetary Fund, which keeps track of financial matters. And you can see that finance actually started reversing. The globalization of finance actually started reversing with the crisis. This is one of the more complex forms of finance, the derivatives market, and it really started declining quite a bit after the crisis as well. So there's challenges with globalization. We can't just assume that it's going to expand. And what I'm going to do today is partly link those challenges to much broader changes in societies in general, all the way from globalization at the sort of biggest scale to people's individual personal experiences, and argue that a lot of the changes that we're seeing in global governance are really part of this large-scale shift. So one of the things that's really noticeable is the increase in disasters. These are technological disasters like plane crashes, chemical factories exploding, these types of things. And you can see it starts at the beginning of the 20th century, huge increase. Now some of this is measurement, but the measurement's been pretty consistent from around here. So there's definitely a large increase in technological disasters. And interestingly, there's also a large, could you go back one please? A large increase in natural disasters. And so that seems puzzling. But if you think about it, one of the reasons is that people are moving into more and more dangerous locations on the sort of edges of cities that are close to oceans that expose them to tsunamis or earthquake-prone zones. And the sort of social character of what people are living in, like their quality of their houses, has a huge impact on the hazardous that they're facing. So you can see these two earthquakes were the same magnitude, but in Haiti, hundreds of thousands of people were hurt or died, and in San Francisco, very few. So disasters are socially constructed, even the natural ones, and they are increasing. So this is the World Economic Forum, which meets once a year in Davos, and it keeps track, or tries to keep track, of all the global risks that are happening. And it consults 1,000 experts around the world from business, government, academia, NGOs, and they start to do this risk map. So you can't see it, obviously, it's way too small, but if you go to the next slide, it starts to, this is on the most hazardous, the biggest damage and the most likely to occur corner of this map. And you can see there's things like greenhouse gases. This one that's a little bit cut off is the financial crisis, climate change. So there's a lot of huge challenges that are associated with globalization. And part of what this is getting at is that people are beginning to see these as interconnected, and they're beginning to map them out and try to figure out what kind of response can be devised to them. So that brings us to global governance. And some of you may be familiar with international relations theories. Rather than go through them with kind of text, I decided to use the visual representations of them. These are the major ones that you would typically study in an international relations course. So this one is power politics, where states run everything. This is the idea of some kind of world government. The UN, some people aspire to making something more ambitious in the United Nations that would really be able to govern the world in a hierarchical, organized fashion. This is the idea that business really runs everything, and then it uses US power to project its own influence around the world. And this is the idea that everything's really driven by technology, and sort of people don't actually need to do anything because the governments will come about pretty much automatically. So my approach, and what I'm going to talk about today in contrast to that is sometimes I've called it an assemblage approach. So this is a picture of an assemblage from art. And the idea of an assemblage is that you bring together things that were used for different purposes, and then when they come together, they create something different. So this has become, talked about in various types of theoretical discussions as a useful analogy for global governance, because often it isn't like a world government, but instead it's clusters of organized activity that sometimes emerge spontaneously, sometimes intentionally, and then they start to work together in often unexpected ways to provide some kind of order or direction to certain areas in the global economy. So some of the issues are, maybe there's too much governance, maybe there's not enough governance, maybe it's just too messy and complex. My view that I'll express in this presentation is that there's actually quite a bit of hope for global governance, but everything, all the risks that I just talked about are expanding so quickly that everything has to move forward faster in order to keep up with them, and that's a huge challenge. So these are some of the macro historical, really big scale changes that seem to be occurring at all levels of society. And some of them everybody's familiar with, the growth of markets, which begins to shape how governance and other institutions are configured. Social acceleration is the idea that everything's speeding up. We're all kind of aware of this. You can measure it. Like an interesting example is that typically in the past, a family might have the same occupation for several generations. And then it became one person would have the same occupation for their whole life. And now you might have the same occupation for a few years, and then you switch to another. There's many other such measures of social acceleration. Growth of knowledge, which really shapes how we organize things, because people are far more competent to do things than in the past. Reflexivity is the idea of people continually re-examining what is done and altering it. And accountability democracy is obviously growing around the world. Risk, I'll come back to, but it's the idea of trying to estimate the probabilities of different alternatives that might occur. So it really shifts people's orientation away from tradition, which is backward-looking, towards the future and how to manage what's coming up. And last, some people talk about a post-social world, that everything we do is so often mediated through television, internet, and various types of objects, documents, and so on, that we're really moving beyond a lot of the social connections to a post-social world. So you can see these changes in business. In the old sort of model, as there were hierarchical corporations that were contained in a national territory, like General Motors, and they raised their finance internally, and there were a lot of different aspects of that. The assembly line, which was very routinized and so on, and it was a command and control structure. Businesses increasingly moved to a network form of organization, which is horizontal, and there's global value chains that are extended across the world, including the raising of finance on capital markets. And a lot of this is managed by, as it says, there's standards, third-party certifications like the ISO certification, and benchmarking. In personal matters, this is The Biggest Loser, which is the TV show. In the past, people tended to organize their lives and their orientation around traditions, cultural traditions, maybe figures in the community that were well respected. Increasingly, people are sort of benchmarking their conduct relative to other forms of expert knowledge, if you want to call it, and in this case, making it really visible to the public through television. There's also a big growth of regulation, contrary to what people sometimes associate globalization with. This is from David Levy-Fowler, who's written a lot about this. This is national regulatory agencies, and you can see over the period of globalization, there was a huge increase in these. And the reason is that more traditional forms of government were being replaced by more decentralized things where regulators, often independent agencies, had a responsibility for setting the rules for that more decentralized form of activity. So these are some of the major changes in global governance, and then I'm going to go through each of these in the subsequent slides. One is a shift from formal governance to informal, and then use of numbers instead of words, materiality, and mediation. Mediation means working through objects. Changes in temporality, private authority, and more complexity. So to start with the change from formality to informality, this is work by Denemark and Hoffman, who traced the number of treaties. And you can see that in the 20th century, so this is 1881, there was a huge increase in formal treaties. And there were treaties about treaties, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. So this was formal international law, and there was also a growth of customary law. All of those are about tradition, but then it started to decline here. Can you? So this is also from their work, where this is trade going up, and you can see treaties, the pace of treaties is declining. So part of what's happening is the growth of informal governance. And this I've just put up here as an example, the UN International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, which is coordinating the world's efforts to respond to the types of natural and technological disasters I mentioned earlier. It's a set of very complex partnerships. The World Economic Forum that I showed earlier is a private sector component of this. So there's regional and all sorts of other ones. This is just quite typical of global governance, but I've put this one up as an illustration. So what's happening with this? Why is this happening? I like the work of this sociologist, Donald Black, who has a book on it's called The Behavior of Law. He has this argument that the relationship between law and relational distance is curvilinear. That sounds kind of complicated. In the midst of strangers, law reaches its highest level. The basic idea is quite intuitive. You don't really deal with your family members using law, usually. I mean, you don't threaten to litigate if you get into a dispute with them. That's where the relational distance is really close. As you get further out, it gets harder and harder to coordinate informally, and then things start to get formalized. When you get really far out, then you don't need law because you're never running into people, or very rarely. It's not worth the cost. So maybe formality is a precondition for informality. You need the basic legal structures in order to have informal things. So that seems to be true of markets, that you need property rights. Seems to be true of pluralistic democracies. You need a constitution for them to operate within. And I think it's true for informal global governance, that it has to be embedded in a structure of treaty law or customary law. So maybe what's happened is that in the Middle Ages, where there was a lot of informality, for instance, the trade and so on was organized by private actors. Then World War II was probably right after, was a height of formal treaty making. And then it started to decline, and that fits with what I just said. So that's formality. To move on then to numbers, I got quite interested in what does it mean if we're using numbers more than words in global governance? Because traditionally in law you use words. But this is part of the Basel Agreement on Bank Capital Adequacy, which is a really important global agreement on regulating finance. I won't go through the details here, but basically it's a good illustration of how numbers can be used in an international arrangement. And part of what's happening is there's an interaction between the standard setter and the banks who have to do all sorts of risk calculations, and this is one of the ways it happens. So what is it about numbers that's different than words? They're more precise, they're more mobile, like they can travel across borders, and you don't need different languages. They can be used for digital things, like digital is really all about numbers. They're stable, like 1 + 1 always equals 2. They can be combined, like 1 + 1 is 2, that's like adding, and they can be ordered, so 1, 2, 3, 4. So they also have these levels of abstraction that interact in interesting ways. You've got binary code, you've got base 10 numbers, databases, statistical risk models, and then at the higher level you've got abstract mathematics, which has absolutely no empirical content. So these things can work together in useful ways, and including in machine systems, which I'll come back to. So one example of the use of numbers is with benchmarks. Now, reputation has always been important in international affairs, and in the past, reputation was usually signaled by the grandeur of the king or something like that. But these days, reputation is signaled often by benchmarking or numbers of some type. So down here you have White Bear Township, Minnesota, got a bond rating upgrade from Moody's in 2003, and they got to the A1 level, which is a very good bond rating. And they were proud of that, so they put it on their website to signal that their finances were in order. So that's an example of a new form of governance that has some similarities with the old one, but it's based on numbers. And there's many other such empirical indices. Like the Program for International Student Assessment measures student performance, and in Canada, because we fell behind in the last one, it created all sorts of debate and efforts to reform the educational system. The open market arrangement in the EU, and then the World Governance Indicators, which shapes flows of development assistance. And it's not just powerful actors that use this. So NGOs are ranking rich countries to see if they're living up to their commitments. Now, another interesting use of numbers, and this gets to the machine system aspect of it, is in commerce. So this is the organization that runs the barcodes. And we often don't really think about barcodes, but the Universal Product Code has been merged with the European one, and now it's called the GS, it's run by GS1. And it has, it's a nonprofit with more than 1.2 million member companies worldwide in 148 countries. So this is a quote from their website. Billions of times each day, the GS1 system of standards connects physical things such as products, locations, logistic units, and assets with information about those things supplied by GS1 communication standards. So this is like a globally interconnected set of standards that runs through machines, to get back to the point about our post-social society. And when you get RFID chips, which is the radio frequency ones, they have enormous capacity so that you can have each single product that is made around the world have a unique identifier and be traced through machine systems. So this is really important for supply chain organization, and it's often starting to get used for environmental accountabilities, labor accountabilities, and other such things, because it really keeps track of even individual products extremely well. So that's an example of numbers. Now, to move to things and objects, these are the crash test dummies. These particular ones are GM dummies. But the reason that they're interesting is that these dummies are not just pieces of plastic. They have standards embedded in them. So they're extremely expensive. Like, to develop there's been a global effort to develop a global dummy for car safety testing. And it cost 14 million euros to create the male version. They didn't yet get to the whole family. But so there's like a Euro dummy and there's a US dummy, but they're converging these. So you can see if it's, and the instruction manual for this thing is 500 pages, and there's another 400 pages of kind of diagrams to how to use it. So this is very expensive, and it's an example of how when global standards get embedded in objects, they actually have a lot of path dependence, and they aren't so easy to change. So another example of objects is what's called the Internet of Things. And I mentioned radio frequency ID chips, but increasingly objects are connected. As a Harvard Business Review said, have your objects call my objects. They're communicating with one another, and they can get more and more sophisticated, so they can alter the temperature of things and so on. In fact, there's quite a bit of concern about medical devices being hooked up and the possibility of them being hacked. So this is really important for supply chains. Also, e-passports, which the US now requires to have RFID chips. So there's 339 million e-passports circulating around the world. The last example there is high-frequency trading, which is run by machines because it's so fast. Like, one firm can, in 20 millionths of a second, decide how to trade, complete a risk analysis, generate a buy or sell order. And the average time for holding stock in the US has dropped from 4 hours to 22 seconds. Yeah. Like 70% of stock in the US, up to 70%, is traded by machines, and it's so fast a human couldn't possibly keep track of it. So These are examples of how objects are beginning to shape human activity. And there's an interesting issue about the degree to which, and I've put up this as to indicate that often once we create an object, we adjust our behavior to match with that. So this is just, I could get into this if people are interested. It raises some interesting theoretical questions about functionality, which is often seen as a bad thing in theories because it really seems to give power to the objects instead of the humans. But if you're thinking about global governance and there's an increasing density of objects floating around, it's quite an important aspect of it. The next topic is time and social acceleration. So there's various aspects of this. I mentioned social acceleration. There's what you could call, and has been called, chronopolitics, the idea of manipulating time. Now, we often think of time as something we can't manipulate because the world does rotate every 24 hours, whether we like it or not. But once you start thinking about it, you realize that there's a lot of human agency and human intention involved in time. So the global time zone, which was created with a lot of effort, is one aspect of that. That's a social construction. And then scheduling. There's a lot of things going on that they could go faster, slower, and the use of schedules for political advantage is huge in global governance. So that's one aspect. And then the orientation to the future that I mentioned rather than tradition with risk management. There's also path dependence, which is an aspect of time. Like a lot of things globally, once they get established, it's not that easy to change. People keep going back to them. So the other aspect of temporality is crisis, that often things really happen super fast and then it limits the options available. These are all ways that time hasn't often been considered adequately in global governance, but is really important. So one particular thing that I'll mention is the G20, and previous to that, the G7, really started displacing the formal organizations like the United Nations, IMF, International Monetary Fund, as the center of global governance in the 1970s. And part of the reason is it's a lot faster. Formal law is way too slow for a lot of the problems that we have today. So the two human rights conventions took about 20 years to ratify and create and ratify. That's like way too slow. And if you look at the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which is like the law about law, it really emphasizes the importance of not allowing anything to change once you write it into a treaty. And so it has very restricted conditions under which a government can change its commitments in a formal treaty. Well, that just doesn't work for a lot of global problems. So informal governance is a solution. And the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, is a leader in peer review, which is one aspect of this informal governance. So this is a description of what it involves, which is to continually revise the best practices that are used to judge a country and then scrutinize whether it still makes sense for the country to do that in the light of how it's changed over the last period of time. Now I'll talk about private authority, which is the next major change. This is a picture of what used to be called a private military company, Blackwater, who got quite notorious for its role in Iraq. Before that, there was already quite a lot of alarm at a certain point when private military companies started taking over parts of countries, say in Africa, and in exchange for resources from the government would start to take over certain parts, and it looked like states were beginning to lose out. So over time, there's been a backlash against private military companies. So there's a couple things that are interesting about this. One is that Blackwater changed its name to Academy, which sounds a lot nicer. The other is that you can just see it's best-in-class operational excellence, your trusted partner in global security, and this says award-winning governance structure. So it has made huge efforts to be legitimate. How did it do that? It hired a lot of political actors, but it also got a law review to, like there's a law review competition of the quality of governance of military companies, and it was the top one. So it kind of is an interesting example of private actors trying to legitimize themselves, even in the area of security and military things, which are one of the sort of things that are closer to power politics. There's also an association of private military companies that are creating standards for private military companies. So one of the things this raises is it's another issue that's related to public and private. It's beginning to get kind of fuzzy. What is public and what is private? So typically we think of governments as public and we think of corporations as private. But there's many, many examples of government agencies that are so captured by the industry they're supposed to be regulating that they're really acting like private actors, even though they are at least legally government actors. And at the same time, a lot of things that corporations do create public spaces. And sometimes when you have discussions of who should regulate the internet, do you want states to regulate that, or do you prefer it to be regulated privately? And similarly, like social media is a way for a public space to be created that is private. Now, the TRIPS and digital rights management is a really interesting case of this. So TRIPS, as many of you may know, is the trade-related intellectual property provisions of the World Trade Organization. And it's a formal international treaty that restricts things like copying videos or copying things illegally, piracy as it's called. And that was an effort that big business made to regain its profitability on movies and music and such. But it didn't work all that well. So another alternative was digital rights management, where they encode the rights of who gets to use something in the product itself. So if you've used Adobe PDF files and so on, there's digital rights management there that can restrict the rights, and we're talking about rights here, rights to use it. And it's a decentralized form of control. So there's languages that allow people to, or the people who are doing the coding, to really, like for instance, the rights expression language is the name of, is a kind of category of software that allocates rights in technical systems. So these are very, often very complex systems of governance that work through machines, because if you want access to a document and you're working off-site, and how do they know if you've got the right to access it? They have to send a message back to the central location. That's the way that a lot of these now work. This little diagram here is just the growth of lobbyists in Washington. That's from Robert Reich's book, Supercapitalism, because this is another aspect, I should have mentioned it before, of the public-private debate, that there's huge lobbying over regulation is really increasing. And then this is the ISEAL Alliance. So ISEAL is a private body that sets, it's kind of an alliance of private standard setters like the Marine Stewardship Council, which you often see on fish products to show that the fish that you're buying is done sustainably, or the Forest Stewardship Council. There began to be a proliferation of these private standards, and it got confusing who to be trusted. So some of them got together and created standards for standards. And this is what this is. So these are all examples of private authority in global governance. So to begin to sum up here, looking over this complexity as a whole, if you think about global governance, there's sort of trade-offs. So in this little diagram here, I've got more global governance going this way and more democracy going that way. On the far left, top left corner, this is more traditional power politics, where states run everything, and there's no global governance, really. It's all about power politics. So there you don't have global governance, and you don't have democracy at the global level. I mean, you may have democracy within the states, but there's no meaning for democracy in global relations. Then if you go to the right on the top row, you've got hegemony and governmentality. So hegemony is the idea of one powerful state or group of actors like wealthy, business people working with states, organizing the whole world, and then that can be a source of order, and often it's better than total chaos, but there's no democracy there. And there's lots of examples of this type of global governance. Governmentality is a term from Foucault that is talking about decentralized governance, but it's very much kind of dominance and submission type of decentralized governance. Now on the bottom left, there's local control, which can be very democratic. A lot of people like that, but then you don't have any capacity to address a lot of the global problems that I talked about earlier. And then, so the question is, can there be anything on the bottom right, in the bottom right cell, that is both providing capacity and dealing with the problem of democracy? Some people, like Dahl, would say impossible because the problems are so big. When you get up to that scale, you can't possibly have democracy. But there are some interesting ways to think about it. Some people have been quite enthusiastic about the idea of global federalism. So you'd have maybe the UN with looking more like the European Union in terms of structure. I'm actually somewhat skeptical that that would work, and there's some disadvantages to having a single structure. So Jonathan Zeitlin and Charles Sable have come up with this experimentalist governance idea. And this is basically that you have goals that can be revised. Then you have many ways of trying to implement those goals, many types of rulemaking. And then you have consistent measures to gauge how effective they are. And then you have rigorous reporting and peer evaluation to figure out which of the various courses of action work best. And then you have ways to revise the rules. So they argue that this can be democratic because it creates public debate about what the options are, and it makes very clear what best practices are. It's kind of complicated, and there's some definite shortcomings of it, but since I'm really trying to highlight the more optimistic view here, this is something that has some promise. So for my conclusion, first is, as I said, global risks continually threaten to outrun our ability to manage them. As the first few slides showed, we live in what Beck has called a risk society, where, for him, risks are actually more serious than wealth. That's arguable as a source of conflict, but certainly we're organizing more and more things relative to risk. And these things that I've gone through, informality numbers, mediating objects, and so on, are elements of the type of complexity in global governance that's associated with these very large-scale macro-historical changes that are occurring at all levels, from our personal life through business, government, national governments, and global governance as well. So my own view is that we need to build on these developments. You can't really reverse them. They're so ubiquitous. They're occurring in all sorts of aspects of our contemporary life. But that if we move fast enough in figuring out how to outrun the risks, then we'll be okay.
Thank you very, very much. So now we would like to open this up for questions and comments. And we would like to be able to record the questions. So I will, Nate will.
Now, Dr. Relevant to, we've seen G8, the various different forms and the informal agreements and the private-public partnership. How do we deal with, in the context of circumvention, transparency, how do we deal with the particular areas of these particular things? There seems to be a particular demographic relevant to within this particular decision-making process. Also, when we talk about the academic, the new group, which was in the nomenclature considered mercenaries, where is the oversight in terms of stakeholders, in terms of the usurping legitimate governments, in terms of that, and the process of interloping going on within these particular private partnerships, because they don't have a particular congressional boundaries. in terms of what they can and cannot do in that particular concern of usurpation. So would you answer the question in terms of usurpation, circumvention, and democracy and transparency, and the demograph in terms of that process within these informal private partnership agreements, and how does that affect the general constituency on the ground?
You have 2 minutes.
Huh.
No.
No, that's a great question, and I think
Two different ones.
yeah. I think it really gets to the heart of some of the debate, that is really crucial to what kind of global governance would work. So some people argue that, one option is to go back to the nation state, right? Where you have mechanisms of transparency and accountability through traditional elections and legislatures like Congress and so on. Another option is to really build up the formal law at the global level. And some people like that because they feel that formal law is really clear. And so it's very, clear what states are committing to. And there can be a form of democracy there because theoretically, if the states are democratically elected and they get together and create a treaty, then the treaty could be said to be legitimate and democratic. The problem, besides the fact that it's very slow moving, is that often citizens don't really follow the negotiations at the global level. So formal law, like the UN, is not a shining example of democracy, accountability, and transparency. So then I think the alternative is to begin to develop criteria or measurements that can be used for these types of informal arrangements that I've been talking about. And criteria like transparency can be measured. Does the organization put what it does on the internet? And then participation can be measured. Does it allow input from people who are concerned about it? One thing that helps a little bit is that not everybody is interested in or needs to be involved in every single aspect of global governance. It's really the people who are affected that have an interest and should be involved in it. So that simplifies it a little bit. But there's no easy answers because it's so complex.
What about the hegemony of demographics? There's a big concern about, in terms of whether in fact it's heterogeneous in terms of class,
Sure.
socioeconomic status, in terms of a particular course of voice, and particular also in gender. Or is it particular or very monocultural and homogeneous in terms of class, education, and status? So how do we overcome these particular barriers? The second part was about academics and the academic company, which was in the vernacular or mercenary in terms of usurpation and their being beyond the sphere of any particular authority in terms of being, saying that you, per se, if you don't like the government of Canada or Hamilton, then you can have them removed if you have enough capital. So, that is a concern.
Yeah.
Whether it be in particularly countries that are yellow, black, or brown, such as we have in Ukraine, Venezuela, Central Republic of Africa, or Okinawa, or Korea, or whatever.
Yeah. So certainly the G7 and the G8 were just completely unrepresentative of the world, right? So they're the wealthy countries that decided that they wanted to run things. And basically, they decided to do that outside the United Nations, outside the universal organizations like the International Monetary Fund. And because they were arguably wealthy, powerful countries, and they were informal and able to move really fast, they started essentially issuing direction to much of really some important policy issues. Now, with the financial crisis, we have the G20, and that's beginning to operate at the leaders level. And you also have the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, and so on, coming up. So you have a proliferation of informal groups that are getting more representative of the diversity of the world. In Africa, for instance, there's an increased reliance on informal groups as well. So if you get a a group of governments together. They can devise a policy and then more effectively have it be heard in global fora. So that's an argument for the promise of this informal governance. And then as far as mercenaries go, I mean, that's a huge problem. But it's interesting, as I said, that this particular organization had to work on its legitimacy. It couldn't really just continue to operate as a rogue military operation. And it's a little bit ambiguous what these military companies, whether they're bad or good. Like initially people said these are all terrible because some of them were South African mercenaries who were looking for something to do after apartheid. And they had a really bad record of working initially with a government in Africa that was horribly violent. But some non-government organizations who are working in conflict zones are saying, should we rely on the government soldiers or should we hire a private security firm? It's not so clear. Maybe the private security firm is more to be trusted. And maybe the governance pressures that the market puts on them or the standards that are created privately are a better guarantee.
But what about the fetters of excess? Is there that's the biggest question, is the fetters of excess. And is there and that's the last statement I'm making, relevant to that, because if we hire a private partnership, are they under the scrutiny and scope? Like this man has a boss. He has a university, he has the answer to the president, provost, department head, so forth and so on. So therefore, he just can't fly by the seat of his pants if, in fact, that may be necessarily the case. So how do we have fetters or controls? There are policies about his conduct in terms of interaction with students, sexually, and whatnot. So I mean, we're not trying to be overarching, but how do you deal with that situation? In particular, they're operating in countries that are black, brown, or yellow.
Yeah, that's a huge issue. So in the case of U.S. Reliance on military contractors, one of the ways they decided to try to control that was to hire contractors to monitor the contractors. And then you start to, worry about who's getting all the money for that. At the same time, it's not guaranteed that if you're using kind of more traditional bureaucratic control mechanisms that people at the bottom levels are really doing what they're supposed to be.
Obviously, with the hiring of mercenaries, as the United States did in Iraq, there's this important question: are they subject to the law of war?
Yeah.
To what extent are they controllable? As private actors, they claim they don't have to conform to those regulations. But implicit in all this discussion is the centrality of the state. When you talk about treaty making, it's states who make treaties. And particularly over the last 3 or 4 or 5 decades, each successive omnibus treaty became larger and larger. Where they had literally thousands of negotiators in Brazil, for example. And the treaty, for example, on the environment has, it's tremendously complicated at this point. No wonder there are fewer new treaties. That doesn't mean that treaties go away, because you still have plenty of treaty enforcement, and maybe it's what we're in is an era of retrenchment where we're figuring out how to operate those treaties and how to enforce them. But the point is, are there any issue areas in which the state has actually surrendered its authority, albeit as a conglomerate of states? Are there any issue areas where the state has become less and less and less important and maybe could be avatars to future ways of dealing with international problems?
Well, I think that the state continues to be really important. So by really highlighting the informal parts of global governance, I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that states are suddenly going to disappear. I think that there's a tendency to overestimate the independence and importance of states. And I do think that treaties have reached, like you suggest one alternative, which is that it's a pause and then the treaty making will regain steam again. I think personally that's probably not likely, because a lot of the changes that we're talking about are so fast moving that the treaty process may not be a great way to deal with them. And we already have a very strong foundation of treaties that are there. So the fact that they've been made, they don't have to be continually, redone. But
It's not just making treaties, it's having governments then affirm them.
yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, so there's a lot of work to be done on treaties, and there's huge advantages to a treaty because it's a formal commitment with obligations. It's very clear what is involved. And certainly in the area of climate change, for instance, if there could be a treaty to govern it, that would be wonderful. Is it going to happen? Hard to say. It may have to end up being informal. Yeah.
Not hard to say.
Right. So your question was also, is there any area where government has given up completely? I mean, it's often very hard to tell what's going on because there's always the possibility that government could step back in, and it's hard to estimate that. But an example is international accounting, where through most of the world, not the United States, but through most of the world now, international accounting standards are set by the International Accounting Standards Board, which is a private body. After the crisis, there was some additional public oversight added to it, but basically those are set, the setting of them is private. Now, there's still a public dimension to that because if you're going to operate in a market, you need the government's authorization, and to do that, you have to comply with those private standards. But there are many examples of that type of private rulemaking, and it's often very hard to disentangle it from the public side, and that's not just chance. It's because a lot of those rules rely on some type of public law or the state or something. I mean, another example is many private contracts rely on courts to enforce them. So you can, with a private contract, create a lot of organizational details, like, for instance, resource management. Like if you've got a mega project in some country and you're planning, a lot of construction and so on, it begins to be a governance structure that's a private contract, but it can be enforced in courts usually. They write that into the contract. So that's an example of where the state's not involved immediately, but it's there in the background to be relied on if necessary.
It's me.
Hi.
Hi. So I wanted to pick up on this conversation about the relationship between the interstate systems, governments, and maybe that last slide you showed before this conclusion, the one where experimentalist goes in the bottom right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I was really intrigued by earlier in your talk you talked about this possibility that formality is a precondition of informality. And certainly that's what a lot of us have found when we try to compare what's going on inside Europe to what's going on outside Europe. So I wanted to push you on that and see what you're thinking, how it might work with an experimentalist architecture. And then I also wanted to ask, I mean, is it possible that an experimentalist architecture or something like it could rest on bargains between the big states? Not formal ones, maybe, but just agreements that we can't possibly have a globalized world if we don't do it this way, so we're just going to do it this way. So it rests on power, but it's not the same old relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, part of the complexity of global governance is that there's so many different types of things to be governed, right? So some of them are very small and technical, and some of them are very big and conflictual and political. And I think that the experimentalism can work in different ways depending on the type of issue. Now, I think you're mostly talking about the really big issues, right? Yeah. But that's, I mean, one shouldn't underestimate the importance of small things, because a lot of what goes on in international commerce and politics and cultural things are, governed by smaller categories of things where you can have competition and different types of ways of doing them. But anyways, to get to the big things, I think that the fact that there is a lot of treaty sort of foundation to global governance now certainly helps in stabilizing something that could look like experimentalist governance. I mean, people are probably not that familiar with this idea, but the basic idea, as I said, is that you allow competition between types of rules, and then you have some mechanism to continually evaluate them and revise them based on which one works best. So I think that you can, like the OECD peer review process is always, evaluating what governments are doing, and some of that is sort of moving governments collectively at the same time in a certain direction. That's a form of transnational governance, even though a lot of that difference is occurring at the national level. And if you start to get governments comparing each other and doing peer reviews, then it starts to integrate what they're doing. And that's a form of experimentalism without the formal treaty structure that the European Union has. And then also you begin to get peer review of international organizations. So you have the international organizations themselves getting compared to one another for best practices. And so you can have, that type of peer review. Peer review can go on at all levels. So the question is, can the sort of principles of good peer review and benchmarking and different rule systems and so on get sufficiently recognized as the best practices for best practices, like the way to do governance, that it becomes the standard way that people think of organizing things. That's sort of what happened with the idea of multilateralism at a certain point, as Ruggie has argued. It's a form that people started, maybe a couple hundred years ago, people wouldn't have conceived that if you have a problem, you should do it in a multilateral fashion. And then over the 19th century, there began to be diplomatic practices that became widely accepted, that you should involve states in certain ways, that they can talk to each other as equals, they can conclude agreements and so on. So you have this evolution of diplomatic practices and ways of organizing things that does, in my opinion, move forward. And I think it's possible that those types of practices could get more established at the global level. But I don't want to overstate it. I mean, it's really quite different than the European Union with the constitutional framework. And it's much more seen things emerge that have promise and maybe will congeal into something more consistent over time.
Okay, you commented on the difficulty about dealing with disasters across the globe. I guess my question is that when you deal with these global disasters, is it possible to deal with them in such a way that the people are benefited in the end instead of harmed? Mm-hmm. Like during Hurricane Katrina, the response was like a neoliberal response, which was to get rid of housing projects, even though the hurricane really didn't make these housing projects uninhabitable. Mm-hmm. So in the light of these global disasters, wouldn't it be best to mobilize the people to get themselves on their feet, mm-hmm. Instead of disrupting their lives in such a way that they must either abandon their community or live there with a lifestyle worse than before the disaster occurred?
Yeah, well, I completely agree with you. And one of the interesting things that has happened in the area of disaster is that the UN, especially, like I mentioned, the UN International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, it has really started to change its view from the idea that disasters are like acts of God. They're things that were not foreseeable, and that therefore all the international community could do was send in a relief team after the hurricane happened or the earthquake happened. That's the old style of emergency response to disaster. Now the way that it's framed is disaster risk reduction. So the UN calls it that, and so does the World Economic Forum. So that's a shift towards, as I said elsewhere, like towards risk, towards trying to anticipate what's coming. Now, it's interesting that if you start to think about how to anticipate, that brings up what's called resilience. So, and also the more general preparedness of the population to be able to anticipate and avoid hurricane disaster. Now, an example to get, just that relates to your point, is that local knowledge is really important because often over large amounts of time, people have accumulated ideas about what kind of signals might show that a disaster is happening, what kind of buildings might withstand an earthquake. And there was some research that showed that when the tsunami that hit a few years ago first started drawing the water out on the beach, people who were not from the community went down, oh, this is really interesting, look at all these shells. People who had lived there for generations said they started running the other way. And similarly, in communities that rely on more traditional structures in earthquake zones, often those have accumulated over long periods of time, and they're designed to withstand earthquakes. But then you have building companies coming in and saying, we'll create housing development, and it will look beautiful, but structurally, it's not prepared to withstand an earthquake. So there's a lot of, it's really important, and the UN has recognized this, to work with people in anticipating where the risks are likely to come and in preparing for them by reorganizing the cities and that type of thing.
What's the next one? So to me, the high-frequency transactions seem game-changing. What effort is there to regulate this? And how stable can the global economy be if transactions are happening this fast, this frequently?
Yeah. Yeah, well, you mentioned the transaction tax. There's a lot of interest in trying to figure out ways to slow down finance in general. And that would certainly do it, because if you're doing that number of transactions a day, every 22 millionths of a second, then the cost of doing even if it's just a tiny little fraction of a cent for each transaction, it starts to mount hugely. There's a whole political issue about whether that's going to happen. But
how to finance international organizations.
Yeah, no, that's true. I know let me come back to that, because the Tobin tax and the whole idea has a lot of promise. One of the definite problems with high-frequency trading is the typical problem with capture, which I mentioned. So, in fact, it's like highly technical, and there's a lot of arguments on the industry part that all this moving in and out of stocks helps smooth things out, and then the regulators. It's remarkable how many of the people who are doing regulation have been high-speed traders and vice versa. So there's the revolving door happening there, which is creating complications. But there are also quite powerful financial interests that are not enthusiastic about high-frequency trading, because it's extremely manipulative. Like, there's this idea of dark pools, which are areas of the kind of electronic trading where it can be done without being observed, even by more traditional traders. So there's a lot of people who are worried, like they don't have the millions of dollars to create these algorithms and automated trading. Plus, they know that the average investor will start to feel the whole game's rigged. So there's people on the other side who have lots of money and stake, who are pushing back against the high-frequency traders. And I think that's useful in any of this type of governance discussion, is to think who will line up on different sides. Because if you have business all on one side and governments all on the other, it makes it hard to regulate. But in the case of disaster, the World Economic Forum that I mentioned is a mostly private initiative. The insurance companies are really big in promoting this, and you can see why. I mean, it's not just that they have a lot of exposure to losing money if something happens, but also they want, and this gets to the idea of needing some kind of formal structure for informal things to happen. The insurance industry realizes that a lot of these disasters could be mitigated if you had insurance policies. But in order to have insurance policies, you need some kind of more general structure within which things will operate. But anyways, to get more directly to the Tobin tax and the high-frequency trading, I mean, I think there's been a lot of interest in this, and sometimes it escalates, and it seems to be getting more on the agenda. I think it will keep coming back, but I think there's probably, it's like less than 50% probability, to put it mildly, that it'll be there, because there's other ways that they're thinking of regulating things, and I think that's more likely, which is basically capital adequacy, if you're familiar with that.
Please allow me to quickly jump in on this, to follow up on this point, to highlight something. Because it seems to me that when you're trying to regulate business, particularly trying to regulate the financial markets, let's say you want to do the Tobin tax. A government could do the Tobin tax, right? The U.S. government, the British government, whatever. But the argument that's made is that the markets will move, that the firms will move. This is globalization preventing a government from regulating, supposedly.
Yep.
Now, if I were the U.S. government, I might try it anyway and see what happens. But the argument for sort of globalized governance is based on the assumption that the states can't get away with doing what makes sense on their own. And so I guess my question is, if you could just sort of address a bit this whole question of businesses playing off states against each other as an aspect of the problem of global governance.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. Sometimes that's called the race to the bottom. They play off states in various ways. One way is to use offshore centers and to move outside of regulatory jurisdictions. And there's an amazingly large amount of money that flows through the offshore centers as a way to avoid regulation. But one of the interesting things that happened with the crisis is that governments started to crack down on this, and it's partial. I mean, they're beginning to create agreements that the offshore centers have to agree to exchange tax information, and there's lots of limitations to that. But that requires some kind of collaboration between governments to make it happen, and often that's really difficult. But I mean, another example is the way that governments compete for inward investment from large firms. They're prepared to spend hundreds of millions of dollars. Is a big issue in Ontario now, because auto manufacturing is huge, and if we don't offer a couple $100 million to an auto firm, they're not likely to set a plant up. So governments have tried to collaborate a bit to avoid being played off one another against, but it doesn't work too well.
Now, Bob Ford was the big thing in Ontario.
Yeah, he's a big embarrassment for us, that's for sure.
I'm sorry.
One of the underlying things that has run through everything you've said, but you haven't really highlighted it, is the power of the multinational corporations. The reason that the informal agreements come fast is because it's in their interest and they make it happen. And I don't really see anything that counters them. Governments have been captured, NGOs try very hard, but they're small and relatively poor. What hope do you see, other than the fact that there might be two multinational corporations with different agendas? But it seems very discouraging to me.
Well, I think that multinational corporations certainly have an interest in speed. So there is an argument that we should just slow everything down. And for instance, the slow food movement is an example of that. Like maybe everything's just simply going too fast. And I think there's something to that. I mean, on the other hand, there are some benefits to things changing. Like tradition is not always great either. So how can you balance that flexibility with the need for being able to control it? I mean, it's a huge problem for democracy because people often don't have the time to vote. And that's a recognized issue. So how do you slow things down enough so that people can participate? I mean, I think part of my optimism would come from the idea that these informal arrangements, I really think, can be used for different things. They don't only benefit corporations. And it's sometimes ambiguous. Like, for instance, there's something, the Equator Principles, which you may be familiar with. They're like a set of principles that banks agreed to about how to scrutinize the environmental consequences of project financing that they might be doing if they're going to be helping finance a dam. There's lots of criticisms of those, but the fact that there's those principles now and the banks are worried enough about it that they're really scrutinizing the environmental aspects. They're seeing, oh, did you actually talk to the people about what would happen if you put the dam in? That type of thing. That's an informal arrangement, and it helps move things forward. And you can find that in labor standards and other areas too. I mean, some corporations have a huge interest in like, if you think of the scandals that have happened around food safety and labor rights in the supply chains, it doesn't work so well for a large corporation to be selling nice little toys, and it turns out there's lead in them because they haven't been monitoring what's happening back in the supplier in China or someplace. And so how do you get the scrutiny of those supply chains? Some of it could be done through standards and having an NGO go in there and check what's happening. Or you might need labor unions or some type of local accountability, because it's really pretty hard to monitor from the head office, and then you start to get collaborative arrangements between a corporation and a labor union or something like that.
We have time for one more question. I was just going to say that in the European Union, there are 11 countries. It doesn't include the UK, but 11 countries that include Germany and France have agreed to experiment with a transaction tax.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So do we have a last question?
No, I'm going to take the privilege. So I guess one of the things that strikes me is that when we talk about the problems of globalization, the difficulties of governing globalization, there seem to be two kinds of things that people have in mind. One is that an assumption that there are things that could be governed by states, but they are on a scale that if a state tries to govern it, the state will not be able to govern it. And an example would be global warming, right? And I guess that the question is, for me, well, and the second thing that people talk about is things where states may not be the best way of governing because states do not have the will. Okay, so the problems are potentially scale and potentially will. And I was wondering if you would comment on developments over time in other contexts. So, for example, there have been situations where states haven't had will and somebody else has substituted, sort of, possibly. And there have been situations over time where scale has been created to match problems. So, are there any models from before globalization, or before the current globalization, that give you models for how things might develop over time, whether 100 years ago or within Canada or within the United States, whatever? Because there's certainly a lot of things in the United States that are not quite regulated by the government, but they're regulated by sort of the National Association of Insurance Commissioners or whoever.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's useful to think of the problem of scale and then the problem of time also, because the time and space, like they're both challenges for regulation. But I think, one of the purposes or the advantages of having global institutions can be to hold governments more accountable. When you're talking about willpower, so in the human rights area, it's well recognized that one of the advantages of having a global human rights regime is that it will watch governments and it will point out, like Amnesty International and others, if they're not observing the proper practices or good standards or whatever. So there's that form of accountability that can help change. You can also, like, the scale isn't necessarily fixed of things, and we tend to think of the scale as something external to what we can affect, but often you can scale something down by just simply reasserting some kind of boundary around a region or something like that. Is that getting at what you're talking about?
Well, there's a key point here, which is that to a certain extent, globalization is chosen.
Yeah.
To a certain extent, globalization happens. So for instance, if we're talking about the world economy and the extent, the free trade regime that encourages and the flows of capital are not necessarily natural facts, right? Globalization could be viewed as something that some people did to other people. At the same time, globalization does have these attributes of natural technological developments and so on. And to me, at least, it's hard to talk about globalization in general without talking about globalization of what, for whom, to whom. And I hope that at some point, maybe if we put together a conference to address these more broadly, we can get you to come back and join us and join some of our scholars and some other scholars to review this more broadly. Thank you very much, Professor Porter. I think for a very long time been one of the leading institutions for the study of international political economy. It gets sort of hard to keep track of his books because there's one that just came out, which is Transnational Financial Regulation After the Crisis, in which I should point out that our own Professor Catherine C. Lavelle has a chapter on what things in the United States, the banks and the Dodd-Frank Act. That's an edited volume. Last year he published Transnational Financial Associations and the Governance of Global Finance. And I think it's fair to say that if there was a short list of scholars who really work on the governance of transnational governance of the global economic system and how that works, if it works at all, Professor Tony Porter is very much on that short list. So it is my great pleasure to welcome him here today and now to sit down and listen to what he has to say.
Well, thank you so much, Joe, for that really generous introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm from Hamilton, and it's not that far, so it was wonderful to be able to come and see people who I've been working with, like Professor Lavelle, Professor Posner, and others, and to be able to be here. So thanks. What I'm
going to attend your review, who also works in this field. And then a few years later, I was reviewing the work of another of my colleagues, trying to figure out who also works in this field. And guess who came up again as somebody who worked in this field? I said, wow. So then if this year, when we were trying to discuss who to invite, a third colleague said, gee, it'd be really great if we could invite Tony Porter. And I'm sitting there, where did I hear that name before? And the answer is that Professor Porter's work is on international financial regulation, international organizations, globalization and its governance in many different ways, is really central to the interests of a number of our own faculty. Therefore, when I said, yeah, that's a really good idea, it's really nice to come up with an idea that a number of your fellow faculty members say, yeah, that's a great idea. So really, on behalf of the whole department, it is my pleasure to welcome you here today, Tony. Now, Tony is, Professor Porter is Director, Associate Dean for Graduate Studies at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. He's spent his entire teaching career, I believe, more than 20 years at McMaster after getting his PhD at Carleton University, which is
It's going to expand. And what I'm going to do today is partly link those challenges to much broader changes in societies in general, all the way from globalization at the sort of biggest scale to people's individual personal experiences, and argue that a lot of the changes that we're seeing in global governance are really part of this large-scale shift. So one of the things that's really noticeable is the increase in disasters. These are technological disasters like plane crashes, chemical factories exploding, these types of things. And you can see it starts at the beginning of the 20th century, huge increase. Now some of this is measurement, but the measurement's been pretty consistent from around here. So there's definitely a large increase in technological disasters. And interestingly, there's also a large, could you go back one please? A large increase in natural disasters. And so that seems puzzling. But if you think about it, one of the reasons is that people are moving into more and more dangerous locations on the sort of edges of cities that are close to oceans that expose them to tsunamis or earthquake-prone zones. And the sort of social character of what people are living in, like their quality of their houses, has a huge impact on the hazardous. What I'm going to do is start with a couple of comments on globalization in general, and then talk about global governance. So this is DHL, the courier company, is very interested in how connected the world is because they deliver packages all over the place. And so they have an interesting set of data with about 1 million data points across all the countries to measure what's happening with globalization. And here the depth is the one that dropped and then started going up again. That's the percentage, say, of each country, say, of trade or finance that's global. And the breadth is the extent that it goes across the world. So you can see after the crisis, there was a kind of reversal of globalization. And so we often assume that globalization is just going to keep expanding and expanding, but that's really not the case. So similarly, this is from the International Monetary Fund, which keeps track of financial matters. And you can see that finance actually started reversing, the globalization of finance actually started reversing with the crisis. This is one of the more complex forms of finance, the derivatives market, and it really started declining quite a bit after the crisis as well. So there's challenges with globalization. We can't just assume that it's
So welcome on this bitterly cold, typical Cleveland Thursday afternoon for the winter of 1913-14. But hopefully we'll have, not heated discussion, but we'll be warmed by the light of intellectual discussion and consideration of matters today. I'm Joe White. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department and director of the Center for Policy Studies at Case Western Reserve University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this global currents discussion, which is supported by the generosity of Ms. Eloise Riskin. And in the global currents discussions, we bring in scholars from around the country and sometimes from around the world to talk about some aspect of international politics, international relations, international public affairs. And today we decided to go for a really big topic, globalization and can globalization be governed? And there's a little history to how we came to invite today's speaker, Professor Tony Porter, which is that I first became aware of Professor Porter as I was reading one of my colleagues' work and trying to think of people who might either participate in the tenure review or advise me about who else should have participated.